opportunities to speak with Jan Assmann about this, and I'm now welcoming our next speaker, the last speaker of today, Bill Deaver. He is the patron, I would say, of North American archaeology of Israel and Palestine, and a very influential figure in the field, and we are very much looking forward to what he's going to tell us about the Exodus narrative and the reality of the Exodus.
Did you notice that in Professor Assmann's fifth plague, in Hebrew it's dever? In Israel, I add a yud and pronounce it devir, Professor Holy of Holies. And now I'm going to inflict that plague on you. The notion of cultural memory is now in vogue among some biblical scholars and historians. As far as I'm concerned, as an archaeologist, this simply designates the fundamental concept with which we deal, culture, which is memory. Culture is formed by the patterned repetition of thoughts and actions in a social context that gives them meaning and reinforces that meaning until the whole becomes tradition, eventually enshrined in literary form. In my judgment, the questions of who eventually wrote down the stories, when, where, and why, these are all of secondary importance. Important, but secondary for the historian, at least an archaeological historian, whose primary concern is with the original events and the attempt to document them. Reception history, also now in vogue, is not of much help, and neither are many biblical scholars who, after the literary turn, deal mostly with the transmission of the story, not any reality behind it. This seems to me yet another flight from history into myth and myth-making, ancient and modern, perhaps another aspect of the legacy of postmodernism. We archaeologists deal with the reality, frozen in time, which has no subsequent memory to compromise it because it's inanimate. It cannot remember. And once it's buried and forgotten, there is no one to observe it and to remember it at all. That's why Albright called the artifacts realia. That is where history writing begins, as far as I can see. Theology, which is historicized myth, comes later, and so does cultural memory. Therefore, archaeologists are understandably not much concerned with cultural memory. Hans Barstad, in the Lester Grabe Festschrift, has recently observed of current cultural history studies among biblicists that while history and memory are always intertwined, they are not identical and they must always be carefully separated. As Barstad puts it, quote, to the historian, everything one does will be governed by the quest to find out what really happened, unquote. He makes a plea for just such a positivist approach, however outdated that seems or naive to many today. Now, contrast that with Lemke's statement in the very same volume, who says rightly that, quote, cultural memory is not history, unquote, but is a way that people construct their histories. Lemke then goes on to declare that, quote, whether or not this construction has much or little to do with what actually happened is something of little interest to students of cultural memory. That's why some of us think the revisionists are, at least historically speaking, nihilists. From the perspective of the historian, and that's what archaeologists are, whether they acknowledge it or not, historians of things, all the current emphasis on cultural memory is really simply another way of talking about tradition. There's really little new here, and nothing very promising for the history of a real Israel in the Iron Age. The fundamental issue is what it was at the beginning of critical studies of our textual sources 150 years ago, historicity. What, if anything, may lie behind the traditions? What actual events may have given rise to these stories? The only thing that has changed now is that archaeology is gradually being recognized as a primary source. Indeed, our only source of external data, which alone may or may not verify the events in question. And now to the questions of my title. First, what did the biblical writers really know? I addressed this question in a 2000 book entitled, What Did the Biblical Writers Know and When Did They Know It? This was a deliberate challenge to the biblical revisionists for whom no real history is possible because it would be inconvenient for their ideology. My answer was that 1, there was a historical Israel in the Iron Age. 2, that many of the biblical narratives are firmly anchored in the context of the Iron Age, not in the revisionist imaginary Persian or Hellenistic eras. And 3, that this flesh and blood Israel is being dramatically brought back to life by archaeological discoveries, now a primary source. Thus, the biblical writers could be good historians by the standards of their day when they chose to be, despite their obvious theocratic program. The Hebrew Bible overall may be Heilsgeschichte, but behind the literary construct that we now have, there undoubtedly lie older oral and written traditions, some of them rooted in reality. That means that historians, with the aid of archaeology as a control and corrective, may sift out from the written sources some genuine historical information here and there. Can we do that, however, with the Exodus story when our extant written sources are at least 6 or 7 years later, 100 years later than the purported events? The dilemma is reflected, I think, in the theme of this symposium, the Hebrew Bible's cultural memory and history, not just cultural memory. I begin to address this question by summarizing what I call convergences, lines of evidence from both our sources, textual and archaeological, that come together to create a portrait of past events that seems realistic, that is true beyond a reasonable doubt. As an archaeological historian, I can attest confidently to several things that the biblical writers did actually know, points at which their stories, however late and tendentious, have gotten it right. First, an Israel as a state and people did exist in Canaan, or our southern Levant, in the Iron Age, and it had a long historical root there. The biblical writers knew that, and we now know it too, not only from the rich and detailed archaeological record, but also from extra-biblical texts like the Merneptah inscription, the Mesha Stela, the Dan Stela, and numerous Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian annals. Despite the biblical revisionist discomfort, this Israel was not invented. It has been discovered. Second, the biblical writers knew that this Israel had arisen partly out of conflict with the age-old Canaanite culture of the region in our Bronze Age. Despite acknowledging some continuities, the biblical writers, however, saw their Israel as revolutionary, a new and different ethnicity with a different sense, a distinct sense of national identity and destiny. Today, despite some skeptics, we can specify Israelite ethnicity in some detail on the basis of an independent analysis of the archaeological record of material culture. The ancient Israelites were demonstrably different from contemporary peoples such as the Philistines, Phoenicians, Arameans, Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, and others. Israel was not unique, to be sure, but it was distinctive in its material culture, and therefore by necessity distinctive in culture in general, including, of course, in religious beliefs and practices. Third, the biblical writers knew that their origins were intertangled with the appearance of the sea peoples in Canaan, particularly the Philistines. They remembered the latter as their enemy for centuries, and they saw their early expansion as the event that triggered the rise of the Israelite monarchy after several generations of charismatic tribal leadership in an agro-pastoral, village-based society. Today, we can easily show that the biblical characterization of the Philistines, although minimal and late, is surprisingly accurate. Furthermore, the prehistory of both peoples and their trajectory toward more complex or state-level formation accords well with our current archaeological knowledge. Finally, the cultural memory of the Hebrew Bible includes an indisputable sense that there had been Egyptian connections. This is preserved in many things, in Egyptian-style names and stories about Joseph and Moses and others, in the fact that knowledge of the deity Yah came perhaps from Midian and the Shasu people there, and above all in the notion that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was greater than the pharaohs of Israel and Egypt and had the power to liberate and create a new, free, and sovereign people. They knew a lot of Egyptian lore and literature. All the above reflects genuine historical knowledge, the formation of a tradition that, however much refracted by later authors and editors, was rooted in reality. That reality is what we now know archaeologically as the Iron Age of ancient Palestine. And that era conforms in broad outline with what the biblical writers knew, at least thus far. But again, the context of this Israel is the Iron Age, not a later period, however much the traditions are revised. The second question is, what do the biblical writers remember? Now, memories do not necessarily correspond to reality. They are constructed out of some genuine recollections, of course, but they're also embellished by later details as well as enhanced by subsequent life experiences. For instance, our memories of our childhood are obviously compounded of things that we actually do recall, plus stories our parents have told us, their memories, and probably also things like mementos and photographs that we still possess. But we all know that these memories, these stories of who we are, tend to grow with constant retelling. I've noticed that. And they often become larger-than-life narratives, still true, but only metaphorically. The biblical memories are like that, as a recapitulation of some of the above memories and events will show. But what about the facts? As historians, whether biblicists or archaeologists, we must deal with such facts as we have, not more speculations that are the stuff of philosophy or theology. Further on memories, there may well have been a long period of slavery for Israel's ancestors in Egypt, since we know from pictorial representations and text that Asiatics or Canaanites had long been present in the Delta and sometimes enslaved there from time to time, from at least the early second millennium. The cities of Ramses and Pitom are well attested in the time of Ramses II, as we have seen, and we have Egyptian depictions of slaves making mud bricks under the reign of Ramses, and even a portrait of Ramses himself beating a foreign slave. Thus, the biblical portrait of Hebrew servitude in Egypt for some 400 years is not essentially fantastic. It may rest on some genuine historical memories of the long-term movement of Amorites and Canaanites into the Delta, known to the Egyptians as Amu, or sand dwellers, from southwestern Asia. Nevertheless, as is well known, there is not a single direct reference in the whole of Egyptian literature to these Hebrews in the 16th through the 13th centuries. When we do meet them, they are Merneptah's Israelites, a little before 1200, said to be somewhere in Canaan, sort of described nonchalantly as a loosely organized people who were said to have been exterminated. Had Egyptian intelligence known these Israelites, or Hebrew peoples, as escaped slaves who had shortly before humiliated the Egyptian Pharaoh, they surely would have further identified them and boasted specifically of the Pharaoh's revenge, as Egyptian literature typically does. Second, the biblical accounts of Yahweh's spectacular miracles enacted through the mediator of Moses are extraordinarily detailed and memorable, and thus the tenacity of the central festival of the Pesach, as Professor Osman so eloquently described it. But no modern sophisticated reader can give much credence to these stories of Yahweh's dramatic intervention in nature and history. Attempts have been made to rationalize these miracles, but that misses the point. They cannot be explained. That's what makes them miracles. You believe them or you do not. The ancient storytellers remembered them and thus believed them. Most of us do not. There's no way of getting around that. And that's why scientific explanations of the miracles miss the point. 3, the biblical memory of wandering through the Sinai, that great and terrible wilderness for some 40 years, is also fraught with difficulties. The biblical stories, at least in the later versions, feature a mixed multitude that to have fielded a fighting force of some 600,000 would have numbered at least 3 million people, an enormous group that the Sinai could never have supported. Attempts to rationalize this inflated figure by playing with the Hebrew term aloof are not particularly persuasive. 4, of the many sites named on the Delta Sinai itinerary, only a few have been positively identified, as we have already seen. the fortress of Migdal, perhaps near Tel El Borg, as Hofmeyr has argued, other sites in the Delta, as Professor Bitok and others have argued, but these are relatively few. Kadesh Barnea, where the Israelites are said to have sojourned for 38 years, is well located at the site of Ain el-Kuderat in the Sinai, and there Israeli archaeologists have discovered a 10th to 8th century fort, probably a later pilgrim site in cultural memory, but nothing other than a few earlier sherds are there. There cannot have been a sojourn of 38 years there in the late 13th century. Even a few Bedouin-like folk would have left some remains. 5, as for the numerous places and peoples the Israelite tribes are said in numbers to have encountered in Transjordan, few can be identified archaeologically, despite several very determined and hopeful efforts by scholars who were highly motivated. The silence of excavations at securely identified sites such as Dibon, Diban, and Heshbon, Hesban, speaks volumes. In Edom, the biblical sites probably did not come into visible existence until relatively late. Some have argued as late as the 7th century. Tom Levy wants to raise the dates, and that will provoke, I'm sure, a very vigorous description and discussion. Now, a few scholars like Redford, Naaman, Rainey, and Faust, the latter tentatively, have tried to connect the early Israelites with the pastoral nomadic Shasu peoples known from Egyptian 19th dynasty texts. But that seems to me largely speculative, and furthermore, such a theory flies in the face of almost everything that we know historically and ethnographically about the sedentarization of pastoral nomads who typically resist being settlement. As Zvi Lederman, a staff member at Isbet once wrote in an article rarely cited, "Nomads, they never were." I'm well aware that others will differ with me, and you will hear tomorrow from my colleagues other theories, including the pastoral nomadization theory. 6, the follow-up of the Exodus and the passage through the Sinai and Transjordan was, of course, the conquest of all of Canaan beyond the Jordan, as recounted in Joshua and less explicitly in Judges. We need to remember that this is one story from the Exodus from Egypt to the conquest of Canaan, the beginning and the end. You cannot separate them. Now, here is the problem, essentially. Of the 31 sites said in the biblical narratives to have been taken, that is, overrun or conquered by invading Israelites, only 2 or 3 show any sign of destructions at the requisite late Bronze Iron One age transition. Hatzor was indeed violently destroyed, but the acting field director, Sharon Zuckerman, thinks that this was due to internecine warfare. Bethel shows the destruction at this site, at this time, followed by a presumably Israelite squatter occupation, but the excavation and publication were too poor to be precise. Tel Zayit also has a major destruction at the end of the Late Bronze Age, which might be attributed to Israelite invaders, but only if the site could be identified confidently with biblical Ziklag, and that's problematic. To make a long story short, today not a single mainstream biblical scholar or archaeologist any longer upholds biblical archaeology's conquest model, not one. Various theories of indigenous origins prevail, in which case there is neither room nor need for a biblical exodus, at least of that proportion. Now, in my view, a small exodus group probably did exist and could have come to be identified eventually with the biblical house of Joseph. And it was they predominantly who formed the tradition, so that later on all of Israel becomes part of this small group. In time, that becomes understandably part of the foundation myth of the Hebrew Bible. But I think the majority of the ancestors of ancient Israel and Judah had never been in Egypt. They were essentially Canaanites, displaced both geographically and ideologically. The point is, if there was no conquest by an Exodus group, there was no Exodus group. And if there was no Exodus group, there was no Exodus. Now, as for the implications of the biblical notion of a pan-military Israelite conquest of Canaan, a few scholars have sought to rationalize the story in several ways. Some evangelical scholars have argued that the biblical narrative of destroyed Canaanite cities specifies that only 3 are actually said to have been burned. Thus, the absence of archaeologically attested destruction layers at many sites means nothing. Yet this is disingenuous. Are we to suppose that the Israelite armed forces drew up at the gates of major Canaanite cities upon which the civilian population surrendered and conveniently disappeared into the hinterland? The overall biblical narrative is clear, and it is about genocide, the extermination of the entire Canaanite population, men, women, and children. Fortunately, it didn't happen, as the authors of Judges acknowledge, and the Deuteronomistic historians accepted by putting the 2 accounts, Joshua and Judges, back to back, even though they cannot be reconciled. Finally, the notion of a 12-tribe league that had persisted throughout the enslavement in Egypt, characterizing the early settlement in Canaan and even continuing into the monarchy, may be a late literary concept. This notion probably crystallized only in the exile, when there was a desperate attempt to create an identity for a people who were now without a state, a temple, or any other national institutions. But the rallying cry, "To your tents, O Israel," I think may be little more than nostalgia for a past that never was. I'm aware that many will differ with me. The previous events, while perhaps based on some cultural memory, and all memory is cultural, are invented rather than being actually remembered. That's a bit disturbing to many. Of course, many biblical scholars are no longer interested in the issue of historicity. Their histories are only histories of the literature or of the Hebrew language, not of a living community. They ask only how the text is able to say what it says, how it functioned as cultural meaning, not whether it is true. As a historian, however, I'm determined to ask the latter question, the historical question, what it means, with no apologies. As for how the Exodus narratives might have functioned in the actual Israelite society of the Iron Age, the answer is that they probably did not function at all, and perhaps until late in the monarchy, when the Pentateuchal sources and the Deuteronomistic history were first reduced to writing, not earlier than the 8th or 7th century. Even then, however, the biblical narrative would have constituted cultural meaning only for the handful of elites who wrote the text. Most ordinary people in ancient Israel and Judah would have had little recourse to this literary tradition and could not have read it if they had had it. There may have been, of course, older oral traditions, some that could have stretched back even to the period of the settlement in the highlands, but speculating about how such oral traditions may have had a part in shaping Israel's ethnogenesis does not seem very useful to me as an archaeologist. On the other hand, the revisionist notion that virtually all of history of Israel was invented goes much too far, even though a good deal of her prehistory was invented. Finally, what did the biblical writers forget? Here I can only speculate, in contrast to asking in my 2001 book, what did they actually know? We must look for a few clues that hint at remnants of a sort of subconscious, largely lost or suppressed knowledge of a now remote past, the memory of which was now fading with the textualization of tradition and soon its scripturalization. Here the test would be whether this fleeting knowledge conforms to what we know with reasonable certainty, thanks to archaeological illumination of the facts on the ground. Without mining the entire Hebrew Bible for such clues, often of necessity reading between the lines, I would suggest that in general, what the biblical writers had forgotten by the late monarchy consisted of the original background of the themes outlined in Part 1 above. That is, the writers knew the consequences of some of the events that they recalled, but they no longer remembered what had actually happened. Here, we have the advantage of hindsight, as well as detailed knowledge of both their past and their future, knowledge not available to them. And here, let me highlight only a few possible examples of lost knowledge, preserved perhaps only in intuition or counterintuition. One, it is well known that in the older strands of the Pentateuchal literature, it is El, the God of the fathers, who predominates, not Yahweh. And this accords well with local late Bronze Age Canaanite traditions, as illustrated particularly well in the Uritic text. The basic sacrificial system of later Israel is likewise well attested at Ugarit. Here we have at least implicit knowledge of elements of cultural continuity, which we can now qualify, and that was the reality. 2, a rare acknowledgement of Canaanite backgrounds is found in Ezekiel 16:2, where the prophet complains, "You are the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother was a Hittite." That's a tacit acknowledgement of indigenous, not foreign origins of the Israelite peoples. One might even argue that the relentless polemics against Canaanite culture are best evidenced, best explained by the fact that this culture was indeed primeval and still influential. Insisting constantly that we are not like them suggests that we actually are, or had been, something we'd rather forget but cannot. 3, remnants of an Aramean connection are well attested by the refrain, "My father was a wandering Aramean." This sentiment is often projected back upon a presumed patriarchal era, but I think it fits much better in the Iron One period in the southern and northern Levant, where we know that the Aramean peoples contemporary with the early Israelite settlers were also becoming sedentary in Syria and would soon experience a similar trajectory toward statehood, or city-statehood in this case. If our earliest Israelites had a history similar to that of the Arameans, this may indicate that both peoples had emerged out of the collapse of local late Bronze Age cultures. Finally, the overall continuity of Israelite and Canaanite culture, increasingly well documented and widely acknowledged now, attest further to indigenous origins. By contrast, there is virtually no Iron One material culture evidence of any Egyptian material at our early Israelite highland sites. And needless to say, I think our earliest Hebrew script and its language are essentially Canaanite, not Moabite, as Rainey had argued. In conclusion, this inquiry began by asking several questions about the Hebrew Bible's cultural memory of supposed events in which the Israelite people began their existence as Hebrew slaves in Egypt, were miraculously liberated, then wandered through the Sinai after 40 years, finally invading and occupying Canaan, the land of promise of the patriarchs. But I think the fact that there was no military conquest of Canaan suggests that this story is partly fictional. The archaeological and extra-biblical textual evidence shows that the larger-than-life stories cannot be read literally as history. They are foundation myths, similar in function to those of other peoples we now know in antiquity. Does that mean that these stories contain no truth? Not at all. There are a few elements, at least, that suggest a long historical memory. And myths, of course, can be true, profoundly true, at least metaphorically, especially when they are couched in a form that has gripped the imagination of countless millions of people for more than 2,000 years. These are stories that still resonate with us, stories about liberation from tyranny, about the power of an apparently insignificant people to change the course of history, about a new Israel, a promised land here, and now. Some, reluctant to abandon literal reading of the treasured biblical narrative, have resorted to desperate measures. They have insisted that a story of a nation's humble origins as slaves is not a story that anyone would simply have made up. However, such a story is the perfect foil against which to portray the Bible's Magnalia Dei, the mighty acts of Yahweh intervening in history to care for and glorify his people, despite all the odds, despite the normal and predictable course of events. Others have argued that such a miraculous, detailed account of the Exodus story could hardly have been invented out of whole cloth. On the contrary, its fantastic character means that the story cannot be read literally or given much credence, at least by modern critical thinkers. In the end, cultural memory is about who we think we are, and that, not the bare facts, is what matters. We can be entirely wrong about what really happened to us, about the past, but what we make of the past as remembered is what comes, in the end, to define us. The ancient Israelites thought that they were different, that they had a unique destiny. They were, and they did have, and that has now become part of our cultural memory. Nevertheless, the Exodus conquest cycle of stories overall is fiction, the stuff of legend. Whoever the early Israelites were, wherever they came from, they were not invaders from Egypt, the Sinai, or Transjordan. They were indigenous peoples in Canaan, whether east or west of the Jordan. The American and Israeli scholars who have written the most extensively about Israelite origins have virtually ignored the biblical Exodus story. We don't need it. The events are not remembered except perhaps in a few details. They are mostly invented. Like the Pilgrim story, for an earlier generation of Americans, it is a foundation myth that works very well, or at least has. Here in California, I think perhaps many people have a different story about their origins. Well, at least the myth has functioned, as we have seen very clearly. But the stories themselves, I think, are what Ernst Axel Knauf once aptly described in another context as, quote, pseudo-histories of non-events, unquote. The real task of modern scholars may be to explain how and why such myths as the Exodus and Conquest stories ever developed in the first place, and above all, why they later became so tenacious. But I suspect that that task is best left to folklorists, historians of comparative religion, students of the philosophy of religion, literary critics, and theologians. That may be the excuse for another symposium of even broader scope, perhaps jointly convened in Cairo, Amman, and Jerusalem. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Deaver, for these very trenchant and provocative, sometimes maybe remarks. So I hope they will inspire both acclaim and maybe also objections from some people in the audience. So can I please invite questions, objections, hesitation? Yes, please.
Bill, Gary Rensburg, thank you for that talk.
Could you maybe come to the micro? Could you come to the micro just maybe to answer questions?
I'm going to assume that you would agree that the archaeological evidence demonstrates that the Philistines arrived on the southern coast of Canaan from the Aegean.
Yes.
Okay. So how is it that a 8th century prophet in Israel, I refer, of course, to Amos, would have the knowledge of a Philistine migration from the Aegean to their cities on the southern coastal plain at a distance of 4.5 centuries, that he would know this about their earliest origins, but you would send up a big question mark about his knowledge of Israel's earliest origins?
It's a good question. I think the answer is fairly clear. The Philistines didn't disappear. They remained Philistine until 604. They knew their own history. They were close neighbors of the Israelites, and there's no reason why the Israelites and the writers of the Bible would not have known something about their origins. I think the difference is, one of the differences, it's easier today to identify the Philistines ethnically in terms of material culture than it is the Israelites. Their material culture was more distinctive. I don't think anybody doubts that we can identify the Philistines, at least of the Sea Peoples, ethnically. Israel is another problem and difficult. But I think there were long cultural memories. I don't doubt it. I think over time they were exaggerated, but I've argued that there is at least a core of factual memory. I wouldn't deny that.
Tom Levy, Bill Deaver's student.
Yeah, I know you.
Well, at the beginning of your talk, I thought you were coming round to thinking about the importance of the Shasu nomad issue connected with ancient Israel. Mm-hmm. And by the end, you made a really strong distinction between, the emergence of Israel as a so-called indigenous versus a foreign construct. And why would if Israel had its origins in a nomadic society from the southern Levant, why would it be considered foreign?
I don't think it did have such origins. That's the point. And by the way, if you think there were some Shasu pastoral nomads and others in the mix of early Israel, I wouldn't doubt that for a moment. But after all, Transjordan is part of Canaan. We're still talking about indigenous Canaanites, whether Shasu, whether, as Finkelstein argues, pastoral nomads from the Central Hills. We're still talking about various Canaanite peoples, not foreigners. I think there were some Shasu nomads, but I don't think they were the majority at all. And I've written extensively on this subject elsewhere, particularly in my 2003 book, Who Were the Early Israelites and Where Did They Come From? And in a forthcoming book, I will deal with the question in more detail. That book is entitled simply An Archaeological History of Ancient Israel and Judah. Many people have thought that no such history can be written, but I gave it a good shot. It's almost ready for press. It will be different. Okay.
Are there any other questions?
I want to go home.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
So you mentioned the issue of the memory and who carried the memory, and you said it was only a memory that was only conveyed on, handed on by a very small group of people. So maybe it is a moment where we could also bring in Jan Assmann again and just speak about who were the carriers of the memory, and did the memory cater to only a very small elite, or did it later become expanded to the entire population? Because basically nowadays the Seder and the celebration of Passover would pertain to everybody. So when did it change?
I think we tend to forget that probably at least 98% of the people in ancient Israel were illiterate. They couldn't have read the Hebrew Bible had they had it. And so I think the lives of ordinary people were very different. Do ordinary people count? I don't know. But they were carriers of a different kind of tradition, not a literate tradition. In the end, perhaps it all came together after the exile. But I have argued strongly in a recent book about the lives of ordinary people that it was a handful of elites who wrote the Hebrew Bible. It was their story, not the story of most people in ancient Israel. My wife tells me, of course, that being an academic, I've never met any ordinary people, but she says some are kind of interesting. And archaeology deals with the ordinary people and their daily lives. Does that matter? I think they also make history.
But the stories could be told, right? So if your child asks you, right? So they're wonderful stories to be told also, right? And
I'm not sure how widespread the knowledge of the stories was. That there was a long oral tradition passed on from mother to daughter and father to son, no one doubts. We're talking about family religion. But I suspect most people had never been to Jerusalem in their whole life, had never met a priest, had never read any of the literary forms, even if they were in existence, until very late in the monarchy. And that's why I think many of us believe that Israelite religion throughout most of the monarchic period was largely polytheistic until the end. Monotheism is a late literary construct of those few who wrote the Bible. But it eventually triumphed. And I was delighted to hear Professor Assmann talk about how difficult monotheism is. It's not a gift, it's an achievement.
But maybe I could just ask some scholars in the third row, Konrad and Thomas and Ron and Jan Assmann, what they think about who carried those traditions and how widespread those memories would have been known. So.
Yeah, my name is Konrad Schmid. I would rather prefer to ask another question regarding an impression I got after your lecture, for which I'm grateful. My impression was that you are distinguishing between a soft and a hard notion of history. Archaeologists deal with what texts denote as a possible reality, and philosophers, theologians, they somehow deal with the literary texts that are related to these events. And somehow what you answered to the last question raised in me the question, wouldn't you somehow think that the literary documents that speak about the Exodus are historical monuments themselves, that deserve the same amount of scrutiny in order to be described as historical artifacts, and only if we really have a clear and decisive notion of what these documents are, for P or self-contained Exodus story, or be it J or E, whatever you assume what these documents were, that only then we can decide about how to possibly reconstruct what the alleged reality is that these texts are speaking of.
It's a fundamental question. I think it all depends on what you mean by history. There are many kinds of history. Archaeologists are well equipped to write certain kinds of history, perhaps better than textual scholars. We can write a history of technology, a history of settlement changes over long periods of time. We cannot write an intellectual history. We probably can't write a theological history. We can write a history of actual practice of religious beliefs. So when I say history, I'm neglecting to say that there are many kinds of history, and archaeologists are well equipped only to write certain kinds of history. That's why my history book will be different from most. I'm not saying the other histories aren't important. I'm simply saying that we're asking somewhat different questions and arriving at somewhat different answers. I don't discard the biblical text for a moment, but they're very selective. Archaeology preserves other kind of evidence that we don't find in the Hebrew Bible or in any other text. I think many of my colleagues in biblical studies simply don't really appreciate material culture. We deal with things. That's what we do. Thing theory. That's what archaeology is about. And it's different. It's different. Perhaps we need new histories of Israel that are teamwork efforts by both textual specialists and material culture specialists. Some of us have talked about it. Some of us have almost tried it. But I wrote my book alone. Next time, maybe one of you will write with me. Right, Ron? We've talked about it. Yeah. What happened? In any case, I think it all depends on what you mean by history and history writing. But it's a wonderful question.
Can I just make a short comment? I think if you look on the Bible, you can also see that the biblical writers, they know what kind of story they want to tell. If you look on the book of Kings, the Pharaoh, they have names. They were named, Sheshong, the Assyrian are named. So if they would tell us the really history of the Exodus, why didn't they give a name to the Pharaoh? Why is this always Pharaoh? Look to the Abraham story. It's the same thing. Is Abraham going to Pharaoh? Is Joseph going to Pharaoh? It's Pharaoh. It's the king of Egypt. It's not one specific king. So I think this should also be taken into account, that we have different genres in the Bible, and that these writers, when they just were naming the king of Egypt, they didn't want to tell a specific story. They want to tell a more symbolic or mythic or whatever kind of story you want to name it. And I think this should also be taken into account before we're looking for the material culture of some names which can happen.
Let me give you a quick example of how the two sources may compare. As I recall, the Hebrew Bible gives 7 verses to Omri. I can write a full volume on the Omri dynasty, easily.
But he's
easily.
named. Yeah, sure.
I'm not saying it's truer, but it's bigger. It's more detailed. And there are many other cases like that where the Hebrew Bible tells us only the story it wants to tell us. Archaeologists can tell other stories, often stories about ordinary people and stories about women.
I'd like to respond to Thomas's question, and this goes to some things that Bill was talking about, and also Jan. As a text person, and I'm completely in agreement with my colleagues, Konrad and Thomas, the text is more complicated than some of the presentations today have indicated. And the answer that I would give to Thomas's question is the very complexity of the text. The term that I would use, borrowed from Jan Assmann, is there are various counter-memories in the text. So these people know what they are constructing their representation of reality to contest. they know in some ways, what they're purposefully forgetting because their adversaries are making this point and they're making this point. So this, to me, indicates that this is a wide discursive field that's not just a few elites sitting in isolated rooms or scribal circles reading texts disengaged from reality. These are widely told stories. These are stories that people mobilize in various ways to make particular claims. They're arguing against other people. Let me just give you an example about this whole conquest thing. One of the things that's going on in Deuteronomy's view of the conquest, I would argue, is that they are purposefully forgetting an older story of the conquest where the indigenous peoples of Canaan were giants. And this is folklore. This is folklore that the Israelites came and slew all these giants. Okay, and we have different kind of peripheral representations of that story that Deuteronomy is contesting. So it's a counter-narrative which presumes a wider cultural discourse that I think cannot be just limited to a few isolated and late elites. So I would argue for a much more pervasive and complicated oral tradition that's being marshaled by various writers for various claims.
Yeah.
And so these are memories and counter-memories.
But you understand that archaeologists are not well equipped to deal with oral traditions.
I know, and that's why you need to listen to us.
And of course, and I think we need to listen to each other. Here's one so simple difference between the text and the artifact. The text represents something else. The artifact is the thing. Of course, I have argued the biblical text is a curated artifact. So once again, of course, and so can the archaeological artifacts. And they are infinitely more complicated than most biblical scholars know. So we simplify each other's views and we talk past each other. That's why we need another symposium and another and another, but not one this long in one day. I came from Cyprus, a 17-hour flight and a 10-hour time difference to be here. Tom, only for you would I do this.
So I think we finish your suffering, right? And we also finish the assumption that you have to live on the memory of your last food and your last meal. So I just invite you. I think there's a dinner outside. So thank you so much for attending today, and we'll meet again tomorrow for the next.